Well, hi, I'm Richard Suada, Director of the Revelation Perth International Film Festival. It's wonderful to have you all tuning in to our Fireside chats. We've got quite a lot coming up. There's a number online already, but it's wonderful to welcome you as the viewer to these Fireside chats, which is a chance to get to meet some of the filmmakers from around the world who are participating in the festival and who we hope have some very interesting things to say about both their movies, about their life in the screen industry, and the way that they perceive the industry right at the moment. But tonight or today or whatever time of the day, this morning, you might be watching this, it's really wonderful to have in the house Dan Mirvish, who has made a really excellent we'll get into the kind of movie it is shortly, but it's a film called a kind of a political film called 18 and a Half. It's a real pleasure to have you on the line, Dan, and to talk about your movie, but not just about your movie, because you are a multifaceted player in the screen industry in the United States. I mean, you're a co-founder of the wonderful Slamdance Film Festival, which has been a great inspiration for the Revelation Film Festival right from the very beginning. We always look at what you're doing, what the program is doing, and the filmmakers that you involve in the program. But you're obviously a filmmaker yourself. You're an author as well, and an inventor. Which, yes, there's the book. Which apparently, according to your own propaganda, was #1 on the Amazon best-selling list for a little while. I don't know. Maybe
for about 5 minutes on one of their lists. So yes, you're very wise to note that it is my own propaganda that
yes.
Not anyone else.
Yeah, look, I'm the same as well, and I'm starting to believe my own propaganda as well, which is like that's a danger.
Yeah, no.
But look, let's talk about 18 and a Half. Maybe you just might want to thumbnail the film for us and tell us what it's about and the period that it's set in and that sort of thing. Just paint us a picture of the film.
Sure. So it's first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone here at Revelation Perth for tuning in. The film 18 and a Half, it's set in 1974 in the U.S. Near Washington D.C., not in Washington, and it's about and it's historical fiction. It's all fictional, but it's about a young woman in the Nixon White House who's a low-level employee. She's a transcriber, and she gets a hold of the missing 18 and a half minute gap in the Nixon Watergate tapes, which was a key thing in the real history of Watergate. It was a real turning point, was this missing gap, which is still missing to this day. Anyway, she gets a hold of a version of it, and she wants to leak it to a reporter, and they wind up at a seaside motel where they run afoul of hippies, swingers, and nefarious forces out to get them. And that's the movie.
Well, that's a very succinct summary of it, but it's a very there's a lot of layers in the movie.
Yeah.
But let's stick with the I guess the actual events and the missing 18 and a half minutes. So what it sounds like a very fascinating story. So what drew you to take this moment in history and turn it into a motion picture?
Well, the most sort of proximate reason was America had just elected Donald Trump as president in November 2016, and literally the next day, I was driving out we actually shot this at the tip of Long Island, and I happened to be visiting a friend of mine there who owns a motel that his grandparents had built in the 50s and 60s. And he's an indie filmmaker himself, but had taken over this place and had maintained the really amazing vintage style, and kind of looks like it was frozen in time in 1974. And they do a lot of fashion shoots out there. It's a working motel during the summer. They do a lot of fashion shoots and music videos, but he said, no one's ever shot a feature here. We're closed in the winter. Cast and crew can stay out here and you can have it basically for free. And I was like, well, and we had just been talking about Watergate with Jules Feiffer, the famous Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist and Oscar winning screenwriter, who had written my last film, Bernard and Huey. And that day we had been discussing comparisons between Trump and Nixon. And so we sort of had Watergate on the brain. And I was like, okay, well, here's, when the film gods give you an amazing location, you listen to them. And then I teamed up with a writing partner, Daniel Moya, who coincidentally his aunt owned a diner that was just down the street from the motel. So we're like, well, that's 2 locations. Now you have to make a movie, you know. And because the biggest, you know, the hardest part about any independent film is you get very nervous about shooting a period film. I mean, even studios do too. And but if the location's doing 90% of the heavy lifting, selling the period, and someone just gives it to you, you're like, all right, let's do it.
Well, you're right. It is very tough to shoot period films, even as recent as kind of the 70s, I suppose. People have really got their eyes peeled, especially people like me who love the vintage world, and I grew up in that time as well. So there's that critical eye that audiences approach the film right from the very beginning. And the locations are most certainly authentic, and there is a wonderful authenticity and honesty actually about the movie, because it feels so effortless in its presentation of the period. Tell us a little bit about, like, there's the locations which really look great, but you know, there's the whole other production design of the costumes and everything else that surrounds it. Tell us a little bit about that, because it's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, well, we had a great costume designer, Sarah Kogan, and she actually collects patterns, clothing patterns on paper from the 70s. And so she was able to make new costumes for our actors that fit our actors, but based on these old patterns. So that really helped a lot. And we had a great production designer, Monica. And but who was able to move things around in the hotel. We had to sort of rebuild the spiral staircase at one point, things like that. But most of the things we could find in the motel property. But you know, what I told everyone on the cast and crew, from the writing partner to post-production to music, was we were only going to use creative techniques and tools, well, at least techniques that could have been used in 1974. So for example, there's no drone shots, there's no steady cams, which came out in 76. And I think by sort of laying down that mandate early on for every department, it really helped us keep a continuity of period. Down to the music, it's only instrumentation because it's all original music. It's mainly kind of bossa nova, Brazilian themed music, but all the instrumentation, even the microphones we use, were all period. And that really helped us kind of focus in on the era.
That's really super interesting. Look, I won't go into things like your budget or anything like that. That's like asking you to show me your underwear or something like that. That's just something I don't want to get into necessarily. But what kind of, in approaching the film in that kind of a way, what kind of challenges were you met with, or did it flow in a very organic and in a way that you completely intended it to go?
Well, everything was going very smoothly until we realized that on our 11th day of production, out of a 15-day shoot, that we were the last film shooting in North America because there was a global pandemic. So we started shooting in March 3rd, 2020. What could possibly go wrong in March of 2020? And we were very isolated. We were about 3 hours outside of New York. We were sort of in our own bubble, but and then we found out that we were pretty much the last film shooting, and everyone else had shut down. So we decided to shut down because that's what people were doing then, which was, you know, sad and frustrating and confusing for everyone around the world. But we needed to do it. And so we took a 6-month healthy hiatus, or pandemic pause, as it were. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I flew back there and started baking sourdough as one did around the world. But about a third of our crew, so about 7 or 8 of them, were kind of the single Brooklyn types. They didn't want to go back to New York because everyone was very afraid of what was going on in New York. So they stayed there. They stayed on location for about 10 weeks. And actually our cinematographer, Elle Schneider, she stayed for 6 months. She stayed the whole, I think she's still there. So, and thankfully we had product placement, Omaha Steaks food, and they just kept eating that instead of resorting to cannibalism, which would have been the other option. And so it was a very weird circumstance, and we didn't know when or if we'd be able to come back. You know, there was so much uncertainty at the time, but thankfully during that 6-month period, because I had grabbed a hard drive and I said, I'm out of here, I'm going back to my family. And I started editing the film. We had, about 75% of the film in the can, so I was able to edit. There's also, for those who see the film, you hear the voices of Richard Nixon and 2 of his aides, and Nixon is played by the great Bruce Campbell, and his aides are played by John Cryer and who people remember from, 2.5 Men and Pretty in Pink, and Ted Raimi, who's Sam Raimi's brother, who's worked with Bruce for a long time. And we actually, the original plan was to do that at the tail end of post-production, but instead we were like, you know what? All these actors are sitting at home on figured out Zoom by now. We all had it, and they were stuck in different parts of the world. And so we're like, why don't we just do it over Zoom? They all, a couple of them had decent microphones, so we were able to kind of use Zoom as sort of the scratch track and then piece it back together. But it was great because in May or June of 2020, actors around the world really couldn't do anything. There was no theater, there was no film, no TV. And this was a great chance in the middle of that to have a couple of days where we could essentially record a little 18.5-minute long radio drama, which was a great relief for all of us that, okay, there's a pandemic going on, we had a setback, but we're still working on the movie. We can still do this, and we can still be creative as filmmakers and actors and artists. Likewise, we started working on the music during that time much more intensely, because musicians around the world were sitting at home not doing anything. So we had musicians, we had a whole horn section that was stuck in Mexico City. So they started working at their studio there. We had a great Brazilian singer named Caro Piaroto, who was working in the studio in LA, but also had to go back to Brazil at one point when she had family had COVID, but we're like, all right, well, can you record in Brazil as long as you're there? And so we were able to do that. We have great composer friend of mine, Luis Guerra, who composed and produced all the music from all these different places. So we were able to keep working. And then it turned out we were one of the first films back shooting in the US using the new Screen Actors Guild and Directors Guild protocols for masking and shields and everything. And luckily we had shot all of our kissing and fighting and dancing scenes, all the kind of intimate scenes that in September you were not allowed to shoot at all. You still had to keep actors far away from each other. So part of it was luck. We'd shot all that stuff already, and a lot of things, and this kind of speaks to independent filmmaking in general, is that a lot of the things you do in independent filmmaking worked well with COVID filmmaking, which is to say we were already all staying in one hotel. Everyone had their own rooms, everyone had their own bathrooms. We were in a bit of a hermetically sealed bubble. So that really lent itself well to us finishing the film in hopefully a pretty seamless way.
Oh, it's seamless, all right. It's very, very smooth. And as I said, the added challenge of working with a period, a period film is like, it's tough. It's tough. So just maybe when, we're talking about the on-set production mechanisms and all that sort of thing, but just before that, the kind of the vision of the film, the actual visual style of the film and the way that it's translated onto the screen. How were you as a director? Were you really precise with the actual components of the film before you started, or was there a little more freewheeling kind of sensibility in the making of the film?
Well, it's a little bit of both. So there's, for example, there's a few long one-shots in the film which are described in the script. We baked them into the script and hope that we could fulfill them. And I think we came pretty close. But as you say, you've got to be flexible, when you're making these films. You can't be too rigid about preconceived shots. Especially even though we had the location, we didn't know exactly which rooms or which cabins we'd be in or until we got out there. But also, you need to work with your cast too. I think this is something people forget is I mean, we didn't really have time for rehearsal, but we were all living out there together. We had a sense of, some actors had been cast for a few weeks or months and had time to really know their script and know their lines. And other actors were cast with like 36 hours notice. So, so you have to know what combinations of actors can maintain a scene in a long 3-minute, 4-minute, 5-minute shot, and which ones just can't because they just showed up and they're not going to memorize a 2-page monologue in 36 hours. So then you have to be flexible about it. And the nice thing is, because I pretty much edit, or at least do some of my editing on all my films, this one I was the sole editor, I have a pretty good sense of how I'm going to cut a scene and whether I need to have coverage, whether I can do it in a one shot, if I'm going to do jump cuts. So I think that really, as for filmmakers, I always say knowing editing is one of the best sort of tools that you as a director kind of need to know. The cinematography, you hire a cinematographer and you hope that everything works well, and hopefully a little bit something about that. But we also, my DP El Schneider and I, we looked at a lot of early 70s films. We were both pretty familiar with them already, but from All the President's Men, which is a Watergate film, but more aesthetically to Clute and Parallax View, The Conversation, 3 Days of the Condor, to goofier ones like The President's Analyst, and then I also was mentored by Robert Altman, and his grandson is still one of my producing partners, and so I learned a lot of techniques kind of from him, like individually miking each actor with their own lavalier mic, and how you use that is you get them to kind of do some overlapping dialogue which gives a more improvised feel for the script, even though the script itself is pretty tightly written. But it gives the actors a much more lived in, feel to their performances.
Tell us a little bit about your relationship with the cinematographer in developing the visual style of them of the film, because it's so potent in that kind of way and does look really excellent, visually across all its elements. But so, when had you worked with that cinematographer before?
No, I'd known her for a long time. I'd known her for about 6 or 7 years, but we hadn't worked together before. But she's actually known for, she was a co-creator or co-ran the company of Digital Bolex, which was this digital Bolex that was around in existence for about 4 or 5 years. And so I knew she had a really good appreciation for vintage cameras using digital cameras with vintage lenses, which is what we ultimately did. We didn't use that camera, we used another camera, but and so we had these 1972 zoom lens. We had a zoom lens and old prime lenses, but kind of knowing when to use which one. That was a lot of what the discussion was about, and really the lenses do most of between the lenses and the location, that's most of the heavy lifting. But also kind of using the same limitations as what they would have had in the 70s too, so that helped a lot, and that was what we talked about a lot.
Did you go into that relationship with a reasonably clear, like, this is the way I want the film to look, or did that kind of come out of looking at all those the other Watergate films and the other political films that you were talking about? Was it like, oh yeah, I'll have a piece of that, I'll have a piece of that, or was it much more defined and then you just looked at those movies to refine and to get a sense of the time?
It was a bit of both. I mean, we didn't, on this film, I had done on my previous film, which was also a little bit influenced by 70s films, I had done much more specific, like, frame grabs of old movies and things like that, and shared those with that cinematographer. I didn't really do that on this one, although I still had those other ones as a reference, which was really helpful. But this one, we didn't have as much sort of pre-production time to really nail down specific things. But partially, knowing the location that we had, we knew which angles looked great and which ones didn't, and which ones did we need to, avoid foliage if it was too green, because the film was set in winter and things like that. So it was yeah, it was more those kind of conversations was, okay, what's going to work well with this particular location and the lighting that we have available to us and that sort of thing. You know, there's also, there's a, you know, there's an extended dinner scene in the movie, in the middle of the movie. And so that with 4 people eating dinner. And so the challenge anytime you do something like that is, okay, well, how do you make that cinematic and break out different sections of that? And so there were a lot of conversations about that. But yeah, that was yeah, it was an ongoing conversation. For sure.
Tell us a little bit about like what was happening on set, like you know, independent films. There's various, you know, again, like all parts of cinema, there are kind of layers of independence and layers of structure, and then there's, you know, looser kind of layers and that sort of thing. So, and I guess as an independent film, again, I'm not going to talk about your budget necessarily, aside from the fact that you would have been probably working on a very tight, very rigid type budget. So what was happening on set? Like how many of you characters were on set, and what, you know, how did it all play out for you?
It was, yeah, it was pretty small, but I mean, they're certainly smaller. So we had about 20 people on crew or so at any given time. And the cast is pretty small. So mostly it was just 2 or 4 actors at the most. And, you know, the nice thing was is we were all staying at this motel, and the rooms themselves are really vintage too. So it sort of got all of us into a little bit of a period 70s vibe, which was great for everyone on the cast and the crew, you know, to all kind of be immersed in this 70s, you know, world. And then you add on top of that, you know, the weird dynamic that, you know, between takes or at dinner, you know, everyone's checking their Twitter feeds or whatever. And it's like, oh my gosh, South by Southwest's been canceled. Broadway's been canceled. The NBA's been canceled. You know, so we had this impending paranoia about the pandemic, which in a weird way kind of works with the tone of the film, which is a bit of a conspiracy paranoid thriller on one sense. So that helped. But it was a lot of fun. I mean, everyone stayed there, so we didn't have to worry about like people driving home, you know, tired or drunk or anything. And so everyone could kind of hang out. Our lead actress, Willa Fitzgerald, had brought her dog with her. So, you know, we were all hanging out with the dog at night and eating barbecue and drinking product placement wine and that sort of thing. So it was a very convivial experience. Everyone got along really well, which doesn't always happen at all. But I think because we had this shared experience of making this film at the end of the world, for all we knew, we were like, all right, let's go out swinging and make the best film we can.
Well, you gave it a pretty good crack. There's no question about it. Tell us a little bit about the cast. Like, are they buddies of yours, people that you'd worked with before, or did you say, I want this person, I want that person, and that sort of thing? How did it all come together in that way?
Well, again, taking the advice of Robert Altman, I mean, one of the best things he ever told us was set a start date, tell everyone the train's leaving the station, and they're on or they're off. And so, of course, we chose the start date at the beginning of a pandemic, but nonetheless, so that really dictated a lot of who was in the cast. And so Willa Fitzgerald, our terrific lead, who a lot of people know her now from the series Reacher, but that shot actually after what we shot. She was recommended by Lucky McKee, another director friend. I mean, this goes back to kind of being part of the Slamdance community. I know a lot of other filmmakers and directors over the years. And so Kelly Reichardt, who directed First Cow, which John Magaro starred in, I know her. She recommended John, and, you know, I'll take her advice. And then someone like Richard Kind, who's in the film, he is someone that I knew before and was in my last film. And so this was the second time we'd worked together. So his part, we wrote a little bit with him in mind, but his schedule's very busy. So we didn't know for sure we would get him, but in the end we did, and he's great in it. But then Vondi Curtis Hall and Kathy Curtin, who played two of the really pivotal parts in the film, they were only cast with about 36 hours notice because other people were dropping out. somewhat because of the pandemic, but just for other schedule reasons. It was pilot season in Hollywood. It was wedding season, so people were dropping out because they had to get married. So you just like, all right, let's make the film with the cast that we have, and eventually, and you sometimes get some really amazing cast, and in fact we did, and so that was really great. Working with them. Bruce Campbell is someone that I had talked about working with on my last film, so we were a little bit familiar with each other and had a way to communicate. And he was really excited about playing Nixon because he had just played Reagan in an episode of Fargo. And as a kid himself, he was 14 years old watching the Nixon Watergate hearings. So, and he and Ted Raimi had done some comedy sketches about Nixon and Watergate. So they were both pretty familiar with it. And then John Cryer, someone that I've known for 30 years, he was a fan of my first film when he was making independent films kind of in the middle of his career. And so we'd stayed in touch, and this was the first time we had a chance to work together.
Well, with regard to the film, let's say the film is in the can, it's out in the marketplace, it's here at Rev. What's the film been doing for you since then? Has there been, did the pandemic kind of open the floodgates to a certain extent for and kind of a new burst of independent cinema and that sort of thing? But so that's a question, but also how has the film been tracking for you since it's been out in the marketplace?
Yeah, well, for better or for worse, I mean, as we know, the first year to year and a half of the pandemic, most festivals were virtual, and most theaters were closed down or sporadic at best, or just drive-ins. So the nice thing for us was it meant that we didn't really have to rush post-production. We could really take our time with post-production. Again, I baked a lot of sourdough. I'd give it to our composer, we'd make more music, give it to the sound folks and that sort of thing. So we could really take our time and try to get it, dial in things in a way that didn't feel rushed at all, because there was no real deadline. And thankfully my investors and backers were not rushing us. So, and then we started to play at festivals in fall of 2001 or 2021, so last fall. 8 months ago or so. And kind of by design, somewhat by accident, we wound up playing about 10 festivals in the fall that were in kind of this trough between the Delta variant and the Omicron variant. And we're like, okay, there's about a 2-month gap where festivals were live and you could really show a film to a real audience and engage with an audience and do real Q&As. And so we really focused on those festivals. And then again, in the spring after Omicron, there was this gap of about a couple months again between the Omicron variant and World War III. And we had another window of opportunity where I could travel with the film. So in the fall we did a number of US festivals, Woodstock and St. Louis and Anchorage and all kinds of places like that, but also internationally. We did our international premiere at the Sao Paulo International Festival in Brazil, which had just opened up. So our composer he went and represented the film there and had a fantastic time, and the Brazilians loved the film. And then I was able to go actually to this, I'm wearing the shirt from it, the festival in Gijón, Spain, which is about the third biggest festival in Spain, which is a great festival. And so that was our European premiere, and I got a t-shirt out of it. And then in the spring, went to Barbados for a festival, because someone has to go there for a film festival.
You poor thing.
And the Manchester International Festival was our UK premiere, where we won. I won the Best Director prize, and COVID came in the goodie bag too. So that
the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away.
Exactly. And then along the way, we found distribution too. So we found a UK-based distributor called 101 Films, as well as an American distributor that did our theatrical release, which we're just kind of at the tail end of that. But we've had a 60-city theatrical release in the US, which, again, 6 months ago was unheard of. A year ago was unheard of. So it's been a great opportunity to play the film in theaters. I'm in Omaha right now in a hotel room. There's my son sitting on the bed over there. And you know, we've got a 2-week engagement in Omaha, and so but I've got a screening in Wichita, Kansas. We had a screening in Orlando, Florida, and we're able to Zoom Q&As.
Yeah.
And kind of, if I can't make it, my writing partner goes, or the DP or the cinematographer goes. So we're kind of using the fact that we had a big team to help represent the film in all these different places. And it just came out on video on demand in the US. It's coming out in the UK. It's coming out on airlines really soon, including, we think, one in New Zealand. So for your friends down under over there, not sure, they may be able to actually see it pretty soon. And then, of course, Revelation Perth is our Australian premiere, which we are super excited about.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's a true honor to be there.
Well, it's wonderful to have the film as part of the program. We've found that this year has been an incredibly strong year for receiving independent films of very high quality, very adventurous films. And you can certainly see the COVID effect in that there's so many more ensemble films and so many more films that deal with, you know, very personal relationships and very intimate relationships, and very simple and very stripped back. So that's really quite a nice development, if anything nice has come out of COVID. So that's an interesting stylistic shift.
Yeah, and that was one thing I found, and I've written about it in some articles for Variety, was that, you know, in a weird way, you know, the film industry, you know, the really big films, studio films, Netflix series, they could, for various insurance reasons, they could get back and start shooting in September, you know, 2020 pretty quickly. They were able to afford these bubbles and things like that. And then little films like ours that were more nimble and could work with the COVID things, and we didn't have big crowd scenes ever in our scripts. So we didn't have to worry about what do you do with a big crowd scene and digital replacements and blow up dolls and things like that. We could make our films. It's the ones in the middle, though, had a really hard time and still are having a hard time kind of getting back up and going. The $5 million films, the $10 million films, the $1 million films even. Those have had a much harder time getting back up and running. But yeah, the little indie films, at least the American ones, we were able to, you know, persevere because we're small films anyway. So there's ways to make them work.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting shift. And speaking of that, I want to talk just briefly a little bit about Slamdance and your and certainly COVID would have had an effect on Slamdance as it did with us. You know, we went online and 1 year, and then we postponed for another year, but we were still able to produce an event and actually physically produce films that we commissioned and that sort of thing, short films and this and that. So that was really good. But just tell us a little bit about Slamdance, because as I said in the opening, it's been a big inspiration for myself as running Rev, and I know for our program director Jack Sargent as well. I mean, you know, it's such a big thing for us. So tell us a little bit about Slamdance and what it's up to and where it's going and where it has been.
Well, yeah, I mean, we started in 1995, and at the time in the States, it was Sundance or nothing, you know, for independent filmmakers, which was okay if you were in Sundance, but and for the first 10 years of Sundance, they had really been great supporters. But by the mid 90s, Hollywood was or independent film was kind of going Hollywood. It was around the same time that Miramax became part of Disney and Fine Line became part of Warner Brothers, and Fox was launching Fox Searchlight. And Sundance kind of went along with that. And they started showing films by bigger directors with bigger budgets and films that already had distribution. And they sort of forgot about the niche of the first time independent filmmakers. So that was when we stepped in and started to, you know, because we had our own films that didn't get into Sundance. And so we started in 95 with a dozen features and a dozen shorts, and literally just showed up 30 feet down the hall from them, from one of their main venues. And, you know, in the global sense of film festivals, we're not the first ones that have done this. I mean, 50 years ago, Directors Fortnight started by a bunch of directors in Cannes and is still going strong and separately from Cannes. So we sort of had that as our model. But anyway, and because of that, we've shown the first films in the US anyway of everyone from Bong Joon-ho to Christopher Nolan, the Russo brothers, Rian Johnson. Paranormal Activity was a Slamdance film, the late Lynn Shelton, some really amazing directors, Ari Aster and Sean Baker and the Safdie brothers and all kinds of people that have gone on to really amazing careers since, but we were the ones who gave them their first opportunity to show their first films. And that's been fun because it has meant to this community of filmmakers, we've all kind of grown up together and can, you know, ask casting questions and things like that, and it's a nice community. So I'm still a little bit involved, not as nearly as involved as I used to be, thankfully, because I'm making my own films, and that's kind of my main priority. And then during the pandemic, you know, we still kind of emulate a lot of what Sundance does, and the circumstances, you know, about being in Utah 3 weeks after New Year's is never good for disease. You know, I'm no epidemiologist, but people have gotten sick at Sundance for years. And so the last 2 years, they wound up being, Sundance wound up canceling the live event and going virtual, and Slamdance did as well. In fact, this past year, we saw the writing on the wall a lot sooner than they did. And we canceled our live event sooner than they did, which I think they kind of regretted because they did it a little bit too late. People lost a lot of money on bookings and things like that. But it's been, you know, in some ways the physical screenings are the least important part of Slamdance itself. It's more the community, and we were able to do that on Zoom and have filmmakers, you know, hang out together. I host a hot tub summit, which is a panel discussion in a hot tub every year. And this year I did it from my bathtub, you know. It was a little weird, but it worked. And so we were able to kind of keep things going, and hopefully next year we'll be live, but you know, we'll see what monkeypox says for all of us. So.
I know it's just never ending.
Yeah.
But maybe it's always been like that, but you know, it seems
we just didn't know. Yeah.
It seems to be never ending. Look, you know, the spirit of Slamdance is really, and the way you were describing about the relationship that you have with the filmmakers from the early parts of their career. Revelation is similar in many ways, and we take our responsibility to filmmakers very profoundly, and we were talking about this just before we started talking in this interview, but I love the way, like, working in the way that we do, if I can project myself into your world in the United States, like, I don't know about you, but I feel personally connected to all of the films that we put in the program. You know, we don't have a program committee that goes, yes, good film, no, yes, no, yes, no. Jack and I look at everything and we program them accordingly. And many of the films are from first-time filmmakers. And in fact, the year before Rev started, there was I was running a prototype, and we showed Todd Phillips's documentary Hated, the Gigi Allen and the Murder Junkies, which just about got me killed in this town anyway. But you know, those kind of relationships and those kind of being part of that kind of community, which is exactly as you describe it, is so incredibly rewarding, and well beyond what it, you know, the relationships can do in your creative life and that sort of thing. It's just so rewarding. It's the most rewarding part of being involved in the industry. So hats off to your work with Slamdance, which has really flown that flag very high for a very long time. So
thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I do take my hat off to you on that. But look, just before we wrap up, I want to hear about your inventions. Your propaganda tells me you're an inventor. Give it to me.
So yeah, I've played around with cameras and lenses a little bit, and so the most prominent thing was about 5 years ago. We were doing doing a crowdfunding campaign for my last film, which is called Bernard and Huey, and we actually hit our goal within 9 days. You know, this was a Kickstarter campaign, and we still had 21 days left to go. And I thought, oh no, the donations have dropped off because everyone thinks we hit our goal. And then I realized that on these Kickstarter campaigns, the ones that actually do best are not for artistic endeavors, but when you have an invention some sort of doodad that someone basically wants to pre-buy. So I thought, all right, I'll just invent something, and then we'll put it on as a new perk on the campaign, and people will just do it. But it's not so easy to invent things, is it? So, but thankfully, my son Jonathan over there and we had just been, he was quite a bit younger then, we had just gone to a thrift store and found a little $1 old 80s Instamatic camera, and I had taken the lens off and played around with it. And basically I came up with this thing where if you put on a Canon DSLR, if you take the lens off and you get just the black plastic lens cap and you drill a hole in it, you put a little tiny lens that we sourced from different places, and then you look through it, everything's out of focus. But then if you get a magnifying glass and you hold it in front of that lens, you get these moments of perfect in focusness, surrounded by all this weird psychedelic distortion and just refraction, and your arm is like it's more like playing a trombone, like with acid jazz trombone but with a camera. Yeah. And no one had ever really done that before. So we put these little kits together. And then like about 100 filmmakers bought these little kits with the magnifying glass and the thing. And I had these interns in my garage, like super gluing everything and hot gluing things together and slicing things. It probably wasn't very healthy, but anyway, so we did that. And then what's great is other filmmakers have then used that in their films. And then in this film, there's a little bit of an homage to that. My cinematographer and I went to a junkyard, basically this electronics junkyard in LA, and we found an old lens that we think may have been from the end of a projector. We don't really know what it was from, but we found this big old lens like this. And then I had my daughter craft a little wooden contraption that held it in place that sort of looks a little bit nautical. We put this in every room that we filmed in the movie. So when you watch 18 and a half, keep an eye out for this weird lens. And as soon as you see, the most prominent time you see it is, and I think it's even in the trailer, it's when Connie and Paul, our main characters, check into the lobby, and you see Connie through this thing that we called the looking glass, and she's upside down in the lens. And so that was kind of a little bit of an homage to the Mirvish scope, which was this other invention. But it also fit thematically with the film. It's a little bit like an Alice in Wonderland analogy. She eats some Wonder Bread at the beginning of the movie, then you see her through the looking glass, and then boom, weird things start to happen. So yeah, so I'm always kind of looking for weird things like that, because I think filmmakers have a tendency to get sort of caught up in the technology of the fastest, hottest lens, most expensive lens and most expensive camera. And it's just a medium for getting the image into the camera, and story-wise it needs to work. And so if you open your mind a little bit and go, okay, well, how can we get the image onto to the audience in an interesting and creative way, then you can invent some cool things.
That's very true. Look, I'm with you on the analog front. Like, I don't want to drone on about myself, but I love 16mm. I have quite a number of 16mm projectors, quite a lot of 16mm film as well that I've collected over the years. And every now and then I drag them out for, like, in the cinema foyer and that sort of thing, and I'll be threading the projector up and I'll turn around and there's literally a crowd of people behind me filming it, just going, what the fuck is that machine? That's just insane. But yeah.
Well, and speaking of analog, we wanted to do the soundtrack, which is all original songs. I wrote the lyrics to the songs, but again, most of the music is by Luis Guerra, my great composer, and we had all these collaborators, and it's all feels like real 60s, 70s music, we hope. And we wanted to put the soundtrack out on vinyl, because that's, that would be the analog. Well, we thought about putting it out on a reel-to-reel player, but we realized nobody had a player. But then there's this backlog with vinyl, so we had to find it takes like a year to get a vinyl record made these days. But I found that they're in the Czech Republic, because back in the Cold War, behind the Iron Curtain, they would smuggle in rock and roll from the West, and then press records onto used medical X-rays. These things were called bones, and there's still a pressing plant in the Czech Republic that is making these things, and they had a much quicker turnaround. So we actually made flexible vinyl record with two of the songs from the film, two of the original songs from the film. So unfortunately, I don't have any of these in Australia because I'm just kind of, humping these around wherever I happen to be at screenings. But anyway, I do encourage everyone to listen to the soundtrack, which is available on Spotify and iTunes. I think even in Australia, you guys should be able to get a hold of the soundtrack pretty easily. So, and just imagine the analog version of that.
Yeah, look, on that note, we might have to leave it, Dan, but look, congratulations on the film. I love the way it just doesn't exist as a film. You've got the 45 there and the whole thing, and it's and your invention is in the picture as well, which is really great.
and this morning I'm heading off to a meeting to talk about a theater company turning the film into a play.
Oh, that would totally work. Yeah, when you watch, for the audience who may not have seen the film yet, or you will be going to see the movie, which you better, it's like really, it's perfect. Yeah, as a play, it is not that it's kind of static, because the film moves around all over the place through various locations and that sort of thing, but it is a very tightly knit kind of format, I suppose, if that's the right phrase, and lots of little individual journeys within each of these pockets of relationships.
Yeah. So that's exciting. But yeah, so the 18.5 journey continues. But very happy to make our first stop in Australia with Revelation Perth, where it's a true honor to be there.
Yeah, well, look, thanks, Dan, and thanks for the pleasure of the movie. Thanks for your time today, and look, best of luck with the picture. I really hope the stage play gets up and running, but also best of luck for everything else beyond this point that you're up to and that sort of thing. And give our love to all the crew at Slam Dance as well.
Will do. All right, and all my best to everyone in Australia.
Good on you. Thanks. See ya. All right.
All right. Thank you, Richard.